Last week, we did not continue the story of how evangelicalism has arrived where it is, as I took last week's passing of Nixon aide Alexander Butterfield, who is known for revealing the existence of the Nixon White House taping system. I took that opportunity to show how even Nixon had more reverence for the guardrails of our constitutional system than what we've seen in the last 10 years from two presidents. Today, we'll get back to that history, but first, as is our custom, I'll cover a few things that have happened in the past week and seek to apply a biblical perspective to them. That's the digest part of Discernment Digest. This past Friday, Robert Mueller died at the age of 81, 1 year older than President Trump. Robert Mueller's biography includes being married to the same woman for 60 years, with whom he had two daughters. He received his undergraduate degree from Princeton in 1966, but he voluntarily enlisted in the Marines after graduating, and that was at the height of the Vietnam War. He served in Vietnam, leading a rifle platoon there, and for his service, he received a Bronze Star, 2 commendation medals, the Purple Heart, which is given to those wounded or killed in action, and the Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry. In 2001, former President George W. Bush appointed, and the Senate unanimously confirmed him to become the 6th director of the FBI on September 4 of 2001. That means he took office just 1 week before 9/11. Remaining in that role until his 12-year term ended on September 4, 2013. And thankfully, we did not have another terror attack on our country under his watch. When President Trump heard of Mueller's passing, he immediately took to his Truth Social account to say this: Robert Mueller just died. Good. I'm glad he's dead. The contrast between these two men of the same age is striking. Mueller was married to one woman for 6 decades. Trump married to 3 with multiple fornications and adulteries before and during those. Mueller volunteered to serve in Vietnam and emerged as a hero. Trump received deferment from service due to bone spurs in his feet. Now, you may recall that Trump refused to call the late John McCain a war hero, even though McCain served honorably during Vietnam, and he spent nearly 5 years in a Vietnamese prison where he was tortured. Trump said of McCain, quote, "I like those who didn't get caught." But despite all of that, some of you may have a dim view of Mueller, and heaven forbid, some may even seek to excuse Trump speaking ill of the dead in that most crass way. Good. I'm glad he's dead. Because of what Trump said next in that Truth Social post. He went on to say, quote, "He can no longer hurt innocent people," and then signed it, President Donald J. Trump. Well, the one innocent person Trump has in mind is himself, because it was Mueller who was asked by a Republican attorney general in 2017 to serve as special counsel to look into allegations of cooperation between Russia and the Trump 2016 campaign, and Trump's relentless claim of a witch hunt and of 20 angry Democrats investigating him. And by the way, Mueller was a lifelong Republican and was asked to serve by a Republican attorney general. But because of that verbal assault, witch hunt, hoax, 20 angry Democrats, many people have come to believe, as a matter of conventional wisdom, that the Russia matter was, in Trump's word again, a hoax. So you may think to yourself, Trump has the right to hate Mueller. After all, Mueller was a terrible person hell-bent on destroying an innocent president. Well, about that innocent part, there were certainly many associates of Trump who were not innocent in the Russia matter and were found liable in courts of law. During the 22 months, just under 2 years of Mueller's investigation, he indicted 34 individuals and 3 Russian businesses. Those indictments led to 7 guilty pleas and 5 people sentenced to prison, including Trump campaign manager Paul Manafort, his deputy Rick Gates, consultant to the campaign Roger Stone, General Michael Flynn for lying to investigators, and at least a dozen Russians for seeking to interfere in the 2016 election on behalf of Trump. With regard to Trump's innocence, we may never know because Mueller refused to indict a sitting president to keep in step with an opinion issued by the Office of Legal Counsel in the mid-1970s that said that it should not be done, that a sitting president be indicted, lest a president be kept from being able to do his job. So Mueller did not indict Trump. And Trump hailed that as a, quote, total exoneration, and many, many have believed it. But Mueller's report, which you can download and read, had 2 volumes, one documenting the many connections between the Trump campaign and Russians, and the other about obstruction of justice. That Trump was interfering in the investigation by dangling pardons before his associates who lied to investigators on Trump's behalf, and some went to jail, as I've mentioned, only to be released when Trump, in fact, did pardon them. And you may remember last week's episode where I talked about Nixon not using pardons to get that same benefit for himself. Manafort, Stone, Flynn, and many others were pardoned or had their sentences commuted by Trump. So Mueller could not indict Trump because he was president, and that precedent of that Office of Legal Counsel opinion that I mentioned, and because he was president, he could ensure any who protected him, Trump, would not face the full consequences, and he did. So I encourage those of you who believe the witch hunt and hoax theories to do as I've recommended from the beginning of this podcast about 3 months ago, saying that discernment requires accuracy in our facts and claims, and going to original sources is the best way to do that. So read the Mueller report as I have. And if you need more proof that at the very minimum it is not a slam dunk that Trump was innocent, the Republican-led Senate Select Committee on Intelligence concluded that Trump likely lied to investigators about his knowledge of Roger Stone's connection with Russians during the 2016 election. You can read that damning 5-volume report online, as it too is available for download and for free. So how did we get to the place that we, including some Christian people, excuse what would have been at any other time inexcusable to all Americans? To say upon the death of a man like Robert Mueller, good, I'm glad he's dead. Well, that's partly why I'm doing the historical survey of evangelicalism, to show what I've said previously, namely that our politics is downstream of culture, and culture is downstream of religion. So there's been a religious shift that has led to a political shift, so that we are willing to tolerate from politicians what would have been disqualifying not too very long ago. We have come to believe that we must win at all costs. Oh, and by the way, this is what Vice President J.D. Vance said back in September when some progressives were celebrating the assassination of Charlie Kirk. He said, quote, "If you celebrate Charlie Kirk's death, you should not be protected from being fired for being a disgusting person." As of the recording of this podcast, Vice President Vance has not commented on the remarks of President Trump about Robert Mueller. A second story from this past week will segue into our continued overview of evangelical history, and that is the arrest of Joseph Duggar and his wife Kendra this past week. Now, this is a second Duggar son who has been arrested for sexual crimes, this time on accusations that he engaged in unlawful sexual activity with a 9-year-old in Florida in 2020. 2 days later, this past week, Kendra, his wife, was arrested and charged with 4 counts of endangering the welfare of a minor and 4 counts of false imprisonment. And this is all after Josh Duggar was sentenced to more than 12 years in prison in 2022 for downloading images depicting child sexual abuse. Now, okay, I've already spent more time than I care to on something so sordid, but I bring it up and I say that it segues to our overview of evangelical history because if you followed that overview, you know that I have centered the analysis on how Christians relate to the culture. And the Duggars had a very clear approach to relating to the culture. And that was creating their own and insulating themselves. And it was erroneously believed by them and by millions of conservative Christian people for decades before 19 Kids and Counting. That's the name of the Duggars television program documenting their lifestyle. Decades before that, it was believed that if you create your own holy environment, that you will raise holy people. Now, no one would say it quite that candidly, but that was the practical import of the approach. And many a fundamentalist family, and I consider myself a fundamentalist, but many a fundamentalist family, church, school, and university has had the same mindset. We'll withdraw and avoid contamination by isolation. Now, I've said that the failure of the fundamentalists and the evangelicals who rejected us in the 1940s, I've said in the past that it was really the same. It was a failure to see clearly the relationship between the Christian and culture. The fundamentalists took the view that if it's not clearly Christian, it's wrong. And the evangelical approach was that if it's not clearly sinful, it's okay. And in so doing, both missed common grace. In God's common grace, the culture can get things right, even though they're not Christian. So the fundamentalists were wrong to assume cultural sin. But God's common grace is never worldly. And so the evangelicals were wrong to assume cultural neutrality. Remember, worldliness is fallen values expressed in culture. So to borrow cultural expressions, we need to discern which forms express fallen values and which are common grace values, and both sides failed in their own way. We've seen that the fundamentalists were willing to, and in fact did, withdraw into their own enclaves, our own societies and schools and colleges and entertainments. The evangelicals were embarrassed by the cultural isolation of the fundamentalists, and they longed for the respectability that they wanted on the world's terms, and they intentionally sought to gain it with an explosion of institutions forming in the 1940s, 1950s for that purpose: magazines, organizations, universities. Christianity Today, the National Association of Evangelicals, the National Association of Religious Broadcasters, the American Scientific Affiliation, and places like Fuller Seminary in Pasadena, California. I said 2 weeks ago that the story of Fuller is a cautionary tale for desiring the approval of the culture and often of the world. As we'll see, its quick doctrinal compromise and its promotion of one later faculty member in particular whose false teaching affects evangelicals and politics to this very day. Now, with regard to Fuller, as we've seen, it began with a stellar faculty and a desire to dialogue with liberal academicians to demonstrate that conservative Christians can hold their own against any worldview. Now, while that's true, certainly it also means that one will need to hold to biblical views that the Academy finds just preposterous. A man swallowed by a great fish and vomited up alive on dry land. A man building a boat on which only 8 people boarded, enough animals 2 by 2 to repopulate a world destroyed by a universal flood. A universe created in 6 days by divine fiat without any existing materials, contrary to the scientific consensus, and on it goes. Fuller could not long withstand the side looks and the sneers, and they began to quickly capitulate to the world by denying the inerrancy of the Bible. That is, they quickly came to believe that the Bible had errors in it. And some of its stories were just that, stories in the form of fables, which, while having a good moral point, as fables do, they're not accurate in the details. The good news for Fuller is that they summoned the integrity to own their change in belief by changing their doctrinal statement eventually to reflect a non-belief in inerrancy. But many other supposed evangelical denominations and schools did not. They harbored professors who in practice denied their institution's doctrinal stance, would annually sign that they believed it, but they would teach something contrary. And this is all documented in Harold Lindsell's bombshell book in 1976, about 30 years after New Evangelicalism started, in which Lindsell names names of such institutions. And he says of Fuller in that book, I'm quoting now, Fuller Theological Seminary was begun in 1947. The faculty drew up a doctrinal statement of faith that committed the institution to an infallible scripture. But changes occurred, and this view was no longer held by some members of the faculty and board of trustees. For a number of years, the institution continued to affirm its loyalty to its confession publicly, while divergencies from that confession were permitted privately. During this period of time, the institution went to work on a new doctrinal statement in which a commitment to an infallible Bible was scrapped. When the new statement was adopted, the Board of Trustees announced it publicly around the country and published it in the catalog of the school. For several years before the new statement was forged, and while some members of the Fuller Seminary family had ceased to believe in an infallible Bible, the institution was placed in the embarrassing situation of saying one thing to the public and another thing to itself. One can only feel the deepest sympathy for an institution when it gets caught up in this kind of predicament. But Fuller Seminary grappled with the problem, and they resolved it by changing its statement of faith to conform to the new reality. It used to profess belief in an inerrant Bible, and it no longer does. It has so stated the change and delivered itself from the charge of ethical delinquency and misconduct. But unlike Fuller Seminary, there are other colleges and seminaries, as well as denominations that, though they have much the same problem, as he says we shall see in this book, The Battle for the Bible, they have not changed their creeds or confessions to reflect the new reality. I'll have occasion to come back to that in future episodes. Now, you may recall the man who wrote that is Harold Lindsell. It's called The Battle for the Bible. You may recall that Harold Lindsell was one of the original faculty at Fuller, but in relatively short order, he saw the downgrade. He resigned, and he started blowing the whistle. But one of Fuller's profs would go on to affect the U.S. religious scene in profound ways, and we're still feeling the effects to this day. C. Peter Wagner. C. Peter Wagner died in 2016 at the age of 86. He taught at Fuller Theological Seminary for 30 years, from 1971 to 2001. He first coined the term New Apostolic Reformation to refer to the growing number of churches in the 1990s that started to accept the idea of present-day apostles. He wrote 6 books on the topic of apostles. He was the presiding leader over the International Coalition of Apostolic Leaders during its formative years from 2001 to 2010. One article says of him, quote, "Wagner is gone, but his influence on the New Apostolic Reformation movement is lasting as the baton of Nair teachings is carried on by others, including Bill Johnson, senior pastor of Bethel Church in Redding, California, and Mike Bickle, founder of the International House of Prayer in Kansas City, Missouri." Now, all of this talk about modern-day apostles should alarm you, because the truth is there is literally no one on earth qualified to be an apostle today. And I encourage you, if you're interested in that topic, to listen to the first few episodes of our current Discovering God series at Community Bible Church on Sunday mornings. It's a series called Connecting to the Apostles. So these people are false teachers right away in their claim to the title apostle in the same sense used by the original 12 and the Apostle Paul in the Bible. And in addition, both the aforementioned Bethel and IHOP, that International House of Prayer, have undergone horrible scandals in the last few years involving these so-called apostles. But in closing today's podcast, I want to introduce you to how Peter Wagner and the New Apostolic Reformation have affected our politics today, as these, quote, apostles have arisen to support President Trump and declare prophecies over him and about him. I'll start with a 75-year-old woman and so-called apostle named Cindy Jacobs, and hopefully you'll see the connections that we'll continue exploring in episodes ahead. Jacobs began to make prophecies, at first mainly personal revelations, warning friends of danger, praying for specific outcomes. Over time, she came to understand that her mission was to be a prophet not just to individuals, but to the world, waging campaigns to convert entire nations. She began convening with other faith leaders such as Lance Wallnau, the far-right televangelist, now most known for his Seven Mountains Mandate. Now, Seven Mountains Mandate is a New Apostolic Reformation rallying belief advocating for a Christian takeover of 7 areas of societal influence: family, religion, education, media, arts and entertainment, business, and government. In 1989, Jacobs met Fuller Seminary professor C. Peter Wagner, a scholar of church growth models and the eventual architect of the New Apostolic Reformation. Jacobs reportedly introduced Wagner to the concept of what he would later term strategic-level spiritual warfare, based on a belief that demonic forces can infiltrate not just beings, but entire territories and seats of power. Casting out these demons requires on-site intervention from gatherings of, quote, prayer warriors. Wagner's United States Strategic Prayer Network was extensive. Each state had a designated warfare coordinator. And Jacobs helped develop the tactics for battle, and she eventually served as a sort of commanding officer when she took over leadership of that network in 2008, about 8 years before Wagner's death. That journey would lead Cindy Jacobs and her followers to the exterior of the United States Capitol on January 6, 2021, where they'd pray to halt the certification of the presidential election results as a mob of Trump supporters stormed the building, as we all know. Now, Cindy Jacobs is an obscure figure to most of us. I would suggest that probably no one that's listening to this podcast even knew her name before listening to this. And Lance Wallnau on Trinity Broadcasting Network, which I hope none of you bother to watch, because almost all of it is not worth it, and not only not worth it, worse, very dangerous in the false teaching that comes over those airwaves. But he's on places like that, and so largely unknown to people like us. But we've been affected by what these people are doing, by the New Apostolic Reformation, by the Seven Mountains Mandate, by these prophecies that are prayed over President Trump. And these are primarily the religious leaders that surround our current president. And most of us are unaware of that. And so we have adopted this idea that we must win at all costs now, and we've been willing to allow people to influence our politics who are frankly people that we wouldn't give the time of day if we knew who they were and what they stood for. So I'm trying to expose that as best I can. I'm going to continue to try to document how we got to where we are, that we are tolerating things in our day that in prior days we would have dismissed out of hand. If you have any questions or comments, you can send those to discern@cbctrenton.com. And I hope you can listen again next Monday. In the meantime, have a great week serving and discerning.